My husband waited until his mother's funeral guests had left before he finally looked at me and smiled. It wasn't grief. It wasn't gratitude. It was relief. Then he handed me a suitcase and quietly said, "I only needed you to take care of my mother while she was sick. Now you're no longer useful." 20 years of marriage ended in one sentence. 10 minutes later, I was standing outside in the pouring rain with nowhere to go. What he didn't know was that his mother had left behind one final letter, and by sunrise, everything he thought belonged to him would be gone. My name is Claire Anderson. I'm 47 years old, and until 3 days ago, I believed 20 years of marriage meant something that could never be erased by a single sentence. I was wrong. If someone had asked me a month ago whether I was happy, I probably would have smiled and said marriage has seasons. Some are beautiful. Some are difficult. I convinced myself we were simply living through one of the difficult ones. Daniel and I met when we were both in our 20s. He was funny, hardworking, and the kind of man who opened doors without making a performance out of it. We married after 3 years, bought a modest home outside Portland, Oregon, and spent the next decade building what looked like an ordinary American life. The only dream we never managed to reach was becoming parents. After years of doctor's appointments, surgeries, and heartbreak, we accepted that children were not part of our story. Instead of pulling us closer together, the disappointment quietly settled between us. Neither of us talked about it anymore. Then 5 years ago, Daniel's mother, Margaret, was diagnosed with a progressive neurological illness. The day we received her diagnosis, I promised her she would never face it alone. At first, Daniel helped. He drove her to appointments, picked up prescriptions, and stayed beside her during difficult nights. But little by little, those responsibilities became mine. His meetings became longer. His business trips became more frequent. His excuses became easier. Before long, I was waking up before sunrise every morning to prepare Margaret's medications, help her bathe, cook every meal, keep track of doctor's instructions, and sit beside her whenever fear stole her sleep. Some nights, I slept barely 3 hours. I never complained because every time Margaret apologized for becoming a burden, I squeezed her hand and reminded her she wasn't one. The truth was, she had become family in a way blood alone could never explain. Daniel rarely noticed how exhausted I looked anymore. Whenever I admitted I was tired, he simply said, "Mom needs you more than ever. We can rest after this is over." Those words became part of our daily life. One quiet evening, after I finished helping Margaret into bed, she reached for my wrist before I turned off the lamp. She looked at me with tired eyes that had somehow remained incredibly kind. Then she whispered something that made me stop breathing for just a second. "Claire, one day, you'll understand why I'm more worried about your future than mine." Margaret passed away 6 weeks later on a quiet Tuesday morning. I was holding her hand when she took her final breath. Just before she closed her eyes, she smiled weakly and whispered, "Thank you for loving me when you never had to." Those were the last words she ever spoke to me. The funeral came 3 days later. I arranged the flowers, met with the pastor, chose the photographs, greeted relatives, and made sure every detail reflected the gentle woman Margaret had been. Daniel stood beside the casket accepting condolences while people praised him for being such a devoted son. I listened without correcting anyone. I was too tired to explain who had really been there during those long nights. When the final guests left and the front door clicked shut, the silence inside the house felt almost unnatural. Daniel loosened his tie, walked into the living room, and poured himself a glass of whiskey. For several seconds, he simply stared out the window. Then he spoke without looking at me. "Claire, we need to talk." I thought he was finally going to cry. Instead, he calmly said, "This marriage has been over for years." I felt my stomach tighten. Before I could answer, he continued, "I only stayed because Mom needed someone to care for her. I couldn't afford full-time professional care, but you did it for free." The room suddenly felt too small to breathe in. I searched his face, hoping to find some sign that this was grief talking. There wasn't one. His expression was cold, calculated, almost relieved. He walked upstairs and returned carrying a suitcase I recognized immediately. It was mine. "I've already spoken with a lawyer," he said. Your clothes are packed. I think it's better if you leave tonight. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Daniel, after 20 years? He shrugged. It doesn't make sense pretending anymore. He carried the suitcase to the front door, opened it, and placed it on the porch. Outside, rain crashed against the driveway in heavy sheets. Without another word, he stepped aside. I walked out because I was too stunned to resist. The door closed behind me with one quiet click. I stood there in the pouring rain, staring at the home I had cleaned, protected, and filled with love for 2 decades. For the first time in my life, I realized I had mistaken being needed for being loved. I spent that night at a small motel less than 10 minutes from the house. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Daniel's voice repeating the same sentence. I only needed you to care for my mother. 20 years had been reduced to one cruel explanation. The next morning, while I was sitting on the edge of the bed wondering where I would even begin rebuilding my life, my phone rang again. It was the same unfamiliar number that had called twice the night before. This time I answered. "Mrs. Anderson?" a calm voice asked. "My name is Thomas Green. I'm Margaret's attorney. She instructed me to contact you after her funeral. Would you be able to come to my office today?" I almost declined. I assumed it was paperwork Daniel had forgotten to mention. Still, something in his voice made me agree. An hour later, I found myself sitting across from a polished oak desk while Mr. Green carefully opened a large envelope. He slid a handwritten letter toward me. "The first instruction from Margaret was very clear," he said softly. "Only Claire is to read this." My hands trembled as I unfolded the pages. The first line blurred through my tears. "My dearest Claire, if you're reading this, then my greatest fear has probably come true." She wrote that she had watched me sacrifice my health, my dreams, and countless years caring for her without ever asking for recognition. She admitted she had also watched Daniel slowly become someone she no longer recognized. She apologized for not confronting him sooner. Then came the sentence that made me stop breathing. "You became the daughter my heart chose, even though life never gave birth to you." I pressed the letter against my chest and cried harder than I had at the funeral. After giving me a few quiet moments, Mr. Green gently placed another folder on the desk. "Margaret revised her estate 8 months ago," he explained. "She transferred her personal savings, investment portfolio, and her fully paid lakeside cottage into your name." I stared at him, unable to speak. He smiled kindly before adding one final sentence. "She wanted you to know that love should never be rewarded only after someone is gone, but this was the only way she could protect the future she believed you deserved." I left Mr. Green's office carrying Margaret's letter so carefully it felt like it was made of glass. Part of me wanted to drive straight to the lakeside cottage. Another part still couldn't believe any of it was real. Before I reached my car, my phone buzzed. It was Mr. Green. "Claire," he said calmly, "I thought you should know. Daniel just arrived. He's here for the estate meeting." I looked back at the building but stayed where I was. "I don't need to be there," I replied quietly. "No," he answered. "You don't." Later that afternoon, Mr. Green called again. This time, his voice carried the exhausted patience of someone who had spent hours repeating the same facts. He told me Daniel had walked into the conference room smiling, convinced the meeting would be routine. He expected to inherit Margaret's savings, her investments, and the lakeside cottage she had owned for nearly 30 years. Instead, Mr. Green placed Margaret's revised estate documents in front of him. Daniel laughed at first. He actually believed there had been a filing mistake. Then he reached the page bearing his mother's signature. The smile disappeared. Mr. Green read Margaret's written statement aloud exactly as she had instructed. "My son stopped caring for people long before he stopped pretending to care for me. The woman who stayed beside me every day deserves my gratitude, my trust, and the security I can still provide. Claire never asked for any of this. That is precisely why she should receive it." According to Mr. Green, Daniel immediately accused me of manipulating his mother. He claimed I had pressured an elderly woman into changing her estate. Mr. Green calmly slid another folder across the table. Inside were medical evaluations confirming Margaret had been mentally competent, witness statements from every signing, and notarized documents completed months before her passing. Every accusation collapsed before it could stand. For the first time in years, Daniel had no explanation that could change reality. While he sat there facing the consequences of his own choices, I drove quietly toward the lakeside cottage. When I unlocked the front door, sunlight reflected across the calm water beyond the windows. The house felt peaceful. For the first time in a very long while, I stepped inside a home where I wasn't expected to earn my place. I stayed at the lakeside cottage for almost 2 weeks before I returned to town. Not because I wanted to hide. I simply needed time to remember what peace felt like. Every morning, I drank coffee on the small porch overlooking the lake, listening to birds instead of arguments. Every evening, I reread Margaret's letter, finding new comfort in words she had written long before either of us knew how everything would end. Then reality slowly caught up. My phone began ringing. The first call came from Daniel's aunt. Instead of questioning me, she apologized. She admitted she had always assumed Daniel had been sharing the responsibility of caring for Margaret because that was the story he told everyone. She said she never imagined I had been carrying the entire burden alone. Over the next several days, more calls followed. Former neighbors remembered seeing my car at Margaret's house every morning before sunrise. Church friends spoke about how Margaret constantly praised my patience whenever Daniel wasn't around. One woman quietly confessed that Margaret had once told her, "Claire is the only reason I still feel safe in my own home." Hearing those words nearly brought me to tears. For years, I had believed no one noticed. The truth was, people had noticed far more than I realized. They simply hadn't known the whole story. Meanwhile, Daniel tried desperately to defend himself. I later learned he called relatives, insisting I had manipulated his sick mother into changing the estate. But every conversation ended the same way. Someone reminded him that they had rarely seen him at doctor's appointments. Someone else remembered me pushing Margaret's wheelchair through church events while Daniel claimed he was too busy with work. His own version of events slowly collapsed beneath years of quiet observations people had never connected until now. The most surprising call came from Margaret's longtime pastor. He told me she had asked him months earlier to pray for me, not because she feared I would fail, but because she feared I would someday believe I deserved the way I had been treated. After we hung up, I sat on the porch staring across the still water. For the first time, I understood something that changed me forever. I no longer needed to explain my worth. The truth had found its own voice, and it spoke far louder than I ever could. 3 weeks passed before Daniel finally appeared at the lakeside cottage. I saw his car through the front window just as the sun was beginning to set across the water. For a moment, I considered pretending I wasn't home. Instead, I opened the door before he could knock. He looked nothing like the confident man who had handed me a suitcase after his mother's funeral. His shoulders were slumped. His eyes were tired. Even his voice sounded smaller. "Claire," he said quietly. "Can we talk?" I stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind me. He apologized for everything. For taking me for granted. For abandoning our marriage. For letting work and pride become more important than the person who had stood beside him for 20 years. Then he looked down at the wooden porch and whispered, "I know I don't deserve another chance, but maybe we could start over." I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I asked only one question. "If your mother had left everything to you instead of me, would you be standing here today asking for another chance?" The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds. But it told me everything. He lowered his eyes and never answered. He didn't have to. For the first time, I wasn't searching his face for hope. I had already found my answer. I smiled gently, not because I had forgiven what happened, but because I no longer needed him to become someone he had never chosen to be. "I truly hope you build a better life, Daniel," I said softly. "But it won't be with me." I stepped back inside. As the door closed between us, I realized I wasn't shutting him out. I was finally protecting the peace I had spent 20 years trying to earn, and had finally learned I deserved all along. 6 months later, the lakeside cottage no longer felt like a place where my old life had ended. It had become the place where my new one truly began. With Margaret's savings and a great deal of careful planning, I transformed the cottage into a small retreat for family caregivers. Not a luxury resort. Not a business built around profit. Just a quiet place where people who spend their lives caring for aging parents, sick spouses, or disabled family members could finally rest without feeling guilty for taking care of themselves. The first guest was a woman in her 60s who had spent 8 years caring for her husband after a stroke. When she arrived, she apologized 3 different times for crying. I smiled and handed her a cup of tea. "You don't have to apologize for being tired here," I told her. Watching the tension leave her face reminded me of the frightened woman I had once been. Every room in the cottage carried a small piece of Margaret's memory. Her favorite rocking chair remained on the porch, overlooking the lake. Her collection of gardening books filled the library shelves. The flower garden she loved continued blooming each spring because I cared for it the same way she once had. One quiet afternoon, I carried fresh lilies to the small memorial bench overlooking the water that we had dedicated to her. I placed the flowers beside it and gently unfolded the letter she had written for me. I read the final paragraph one more time before carefully placing it back inside its envelope. Then I looked across the peaceful lake and whispered, "Thank you for seeing my worth before I could see it myself." The breeze carried the words away, but somehow I believed she had heard them. Looking back now, I no longer think the greatest gift Margaret left me was the cottage or the savings. It was the reminder that love is never measured by how much of yourself you are willing to lose for someone else. Real family doesn't make you earn kindness. Real love never turns sacrifice into a transaction. And sometimes, the bravest thing you'll ever do is walk away from the people who only valued you when they believed they could use you. That was the day I finally stopped surviving and truly started living.